Malaprop is one of my favorite all-time bookstores, and I am going to Asheville in just like a few weeks, and I'm so excited that I get to return and buy all the books. So I'm also really thrilled to be talking today. So we thought we'd do this sort of Nimisha we'd sort of have a conversation about the book. Yeah, Nimisha, I'll hand it over to you.
Sounds good. So very excited to talk with you, Sarah, about this book, which, as you know, I got to read before everybody else. And it's got to be the most lurid book I have read in such a long time. And it's really one of those books where you're thinking to yourself, how is any of this true? So I'd love to ask you, just right out of the gate, the question that's probably on everybody's mind. How did you find out about this woman and this story?
Yeah, so about 10 years ago, I was on a tour of Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. So it's where Jim Morrison is buried, where all the kind of like fancy French people are buried. And our tour guide was taking us past the tomb of Félix Faure, the man who was president of France in the 1890s. And our tour guide stopped and had to mention the thing that like French people know about Félix Faure, which is that he died while he was having an assignation with his mistress. And then our tour guide was like, wait, that's not even the most absurd part of it. And he said that the mistress, then a batch of years later, her husband and mother were murdered and she was the only survivor. And the tour guide strongly implied that she might have done it. And I did not believe this. I thought this was an urban legend. I was just like, this is just the sort of story that the French people like to tell about their politicians and their politicians' love lives. Like, this is not true at all. But I was intrigued enough to look it up. I had never heard about this. I mean, I have a PhD in French history, but I had never heard about this. And I found out he was telling the truth, right? That there was this woman, her name was Margeurite Steinheil, although everyone sort of knew her as Meg. And she was this femme fatale who left a trail of death and destruction in her wake. She just broke every rule in the book, and for the most part, she got away with it. And I think like one of the things that I often struggled with is that if I was writing this as fiction, no one would believe me. There's so many just like totally wild things. The sort of night of the murders, she's tied to the bed in the home where she lives with her husband. And her mother is also there, and she's tied toe by toe to the bed. Like, that is, if I made that up as fiction, people would say, like, this is not believable. And so I often was like, am I making this up? Like, you know, none of this makes any sense. And then I would just go back to the sources, and I would be like, oh, wait, no, I remembered it correctly. She was actually tied toe by toe to the bed on the night of the murders. And I really fell in love with the story when I got into the Parisian police archives, which is this very small archives just outside Paris, and they have the investigative file into the double murders. But it also has like a whole investigation into her love life and her like her childhood and her family background. And it's just absolutely bananas. And no one knew the whole story. There's been a lot of French people who have written about her, but they haven't really looked at their archival sources, which is just like totally stuff I could not make up, even if I had tried. Like, her family has this habit of sleeping with other members of the family to get back at each other. Which is like a very strange family tradition. And so I really just was like, I have to tell the story. It's so wild. She is like not always a good person, but she's always fun to write about. And I hope that comes through, that she's also really fun to read about. Yeah, thank you for that.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for explaining that too, because it's just a reminder of the kinds of like serendipity that can lead down this amazing rabbit hole that leads to such beautiful works of art like this book. So thank you so much. So I'm not sure if everybody's already read the book. So maybe you could just sort of catch us up on some of the main details. So you talked a little bit about her very interesting family and their interesting family traditions. Can you tell us more about her childhood and maybe her relationship to her parents as well?
So she's born in 1869 in a town in eastern France called Beaucourt, which is really dominated by a sort of family firm called Japy Brothers. And they manufacture metalwork and like clocks and things like that. And her father is one of the members of the Japy family. He's Edward Japy. And he's the black sheep of the family, though, and he is always misbehaving, sometimes in ways that are really funny and sometimes in ways that are like really terrible and tragic. And so when he is 26, he falls in love with the 14-year-old daughter of an innkeeper. And he knows she's too young to marry. And then he marries her 2 years later when she is 16 and he is 28. And to us, like, we are absolutely shocked by the age difference. That's so disturbing to us. And it was unusual for the time. She would definitely be seen as too young. But what's really scandalous at the time is the fact that there's a big class difference between the two. That he's from this very wealthy bourgeois family, and that she is a sort of daughter of the people from a very humble background. And so they have 4 children, of which Marguerite is the third. And so she's born a scandal. When she's born, she comes out of this family that is, she grows up amongst all her cousins, all her father's relatives, but it's always sort of treated, because of her father and the father's marriage, as a little bit scandalous and sort of held apart. And her father he's the life of the party. He's very charming. He's very outgoing. He's very generous. He's also violent and is abusive towards her mother. And she really, she sort of, I'm sure she witnessed it, but she cannot understand this. And so she just sees that her father is someone who loves her very deeply. And he's very invested in teaching her things like how to walk seductively and how to go up upstairs in a way that is appealing to men. And we see this as very creepy. And like, for us, it's very creepy. For her, it was a sign of his love. And so she really associated male attention always throughout her life as power, as proof of love, as proof of her magnetism. She was very close to her father. She was clearly his favorite. And she loves her mother, but she's also frustrated by her mother. She sees her mother as passive, as very childlike. And we might see that her mother was sort of given no choice but to be passive, given this kind of really troubling circumstances of the marriage. But she, throughout her life, really defines herself as her father's daughter, as someone who's going to be active and engaged and charming and outgoing and in opposition to her mother, and never, ever passive. And there are times that works out very well for her. And then there are times where it sort of completely backfires on her and puts her in a lot of danger. So she is sort of raised in this kind of almost like hothouse atmosphere of scandal, of her father's sort of misbehavior. He's a partier. He's also has a problem with alcohol and is seducing all the women of the town, much to everyone's dismay. And she, in many ways, takes after him, and kind of unusually for the time, has sort of romances as an adolescent. Which was not really permitted by the rules of the day, and her parents don't really seem to care. And so when she's maybe around 18, she falls in love with a friend of her brother's, who is an army officer. They want to get engaged, and they get engaged secretly, which is absolutely not done. And then they also have sex with each other, which was 100% not done at the time. And her father finds out and he flips out, and he breaks the engagement off and he forbids the two from ever seeing each other. And then he sends her away to live with her older sister all across France. And as a sort of punishment for her, what he saw as her terrible misbehavior. And then a few months later, while she's still living with her sister on the other side of France, he drops dead of a heart attack, probably brought on by the kind of stress of what he saw as his favorite daughter's monstrous betrayal. But that really, she's sort of lost the man she sees as her protector, the man she sort of idolizes, and is, in this position where she's lost her father. She has an engagement that has been broken off by her family. The whole town knows about this, is totally scandalized by her behavior, and she has to find someone to marry. And so that puts her into a circumstance where she ends up marrying an artist who's much, much older than she is. When they get married, she is 21 and he is 40. She doesn't really love him, but he is very much in love with her. And it's the one time in life where she's passive and she sort of does what her family wants her to do. And she decides to get married to him. And it does not work out so well for her. So she's always trying to navigate between this sort of, trying to avoid her mother's passivity, trying to be like her father, both in the way that he was as this sort of outgoing, charismatic, seductive, charming figure, but also trying to be the woman that he wanted her to be, right? Someone who would sort of really kind of be outgoing, be charming, and also draw men's attention.
Fascinating. Thank you. I mean, just sort of sketching that out for us helps us to understand how her parents' own marriage probably really imprinted deeply on her. And then you just mentioned Meg's marriage, and you talked a little bit about the fact that there was a lack of love there, a very large age difference, and so much more. So could you tell us more about this marriage? What happened? You talked about how maybe this was the first time that she was actually trying to do what her family said. But what did that marriage actually look like from the inside?
It does not work out well for her, that she, I think, learns the lesson not to be passive and not to do what her family wants. So his name is Adolf Steinheil. He's a painter. The great appeal is that he lives in Paris. And she thinks that she will, by marrying someone older, she will get another father figure, but it turns out he's very passive. So she ends up kind of marrying her mother. And so there's this kind of temperamental incompatibility, that she really wants someone who's sort of strong and outgoing, and he's shy and timid and very passive. He lives a kind of middle-class existence, as a not very fashionable painter. He's sort of, this is the era of impressionism, and he's painting in kind of what's a very old-fashioned style. And he's quite content with the sort of, what she sees as a kind of boring middle-class existence. And she's very ambitious. She wants to enter high society. She wants to make him into this sort of really important painter. So then there's also the kind of money, that she wants more money, and he doesn't have a lot of money. They're also terrible managers of money. So they, anytime they have money, they just spend it on absurd things. And then another source of discontent is that he is having affairs with both men and women, which really horrified her. I think she either walks in on him having an affair, having sex with another man, or sort of has letters to that effect. And that was seen as really, really kind of atrocious behavior by the standards of the day. And she absolutely sort of accepts all those prejudices. And so it is not a happy marriage. She thinks about divorcing him. And he begs her not to, partly because they have a daughter, and it's sort of, the wanting to raise the daughter together. And then partly because divorce was really scandalous. And so she's sort of like, well, to avoid a scandal, I will stay married. And what's remarkable about her is she spends her entire life trying to avoid scandal, but by doing that, just ends up absolutely blowing up her life and creating an even bigger scandal from it.
Which brings us to one of the things you just mentioned, how she's, sort of trying to groom her husband so that they can both access Parisian high society. So tell us a little bit about whether she actually makes it and how she got there.
She does. What's remarkable about her is like she is always creating these fantasy worlds. And sometimes it actually works out for her that she can sort of create the fantasy world that she wants. And she does it through affairs with men. Her first lover is her husband's best friend, which is a really great way to get back at him. But he's a prominent former attorney general, basically. And she starts having a series of affairs with prominent men in high society who help her access high society, but also who give her money. And she structures she's essentially a sex worker, and she structures her sex work in very unusual ways for the time. Is she will go to kind of friends, acquaintances, people she's met, and say, if you buy one of my husband's paintings, I will have an affair with you. And so this is a way she's trying to build her husband's career. So to like kind of make him the famous portrait painter of the French elite. But it's also a way she doesn't have to touch the money, right? And she can sort of maintain this fiction that she's just a respectable middle-class woman, or respectable woman of high society. And so she starts having affairs with a really kind of who's who of a French elite. So politicians, really important officials, particularly in the judiciary, industrialists, financiers, maybe some various heads of royal families, or not heads of royal families, but members of various royal families in Europe, for instance, the then Prince of Wales, right, who was a sort of notorious lover of women, and had lots of mistresses. They seem to have a brief affair. And the sister's plan is to sort of use her charm, her seductive capacity, to launch herself into Parisian high society. And she's quite successful at it. She really makes it. And by 1897, she's clearly made it. She has a kind of string of prominent lovers. And that summer, she runs across the president of France in the Alps when he is kind of watching the troops, and she's on vacation. And he, this is Felix Faure, he falls in love with her. She's not super into him, but she does like being the position of being the president's mistress. And they start a relationship.
Amazing. Thank you. Well, so the question that's on everyone's mind, two questions. One is, how true is that story about her and the president? And then I have a question about what happened on the evening of May 1908, but let's do that first one.
Yeah. So in February 1899, she goes to see the president for their daily assignation. He has a stroke. And then she flees the Élysée Palace, which is the French White House, after he has the stroke, and then he dies a few hours afterwards. So he doesn't die on the spot. We do know, it's very clear and it's very well documented, including by people who were like really trying to salvage Faure's reputation, that they were together when he has the stroke. It's not clear what they're doing, and there are legends that they're engaged in a very particular sex act, and that his aides have to cut her hair out of his hands because he's sort of, as he's having the stroke, he's grasping her hair so tightly that he can't release it. I don't know if that's true. So it could be like they're just together and maybe not having sex yet, or it could be that they are having sex, but it is 100% verified that like she is there while he has the stroke that then kills him a few hours later. And she's very embarrassed, as you could imagine. And like, you know, everyone is, her name is not in the newspapers, but everyone, you know, the kind of Parisian gossip all is like, here's how she died. Or here's how he died. And so it's this sort of scandal, again, that part of the reason that happens is she's trying to avoid a scandal by not divorcing her husband, and, you know, ends up like having a president die on her. So yeah, she kind of more or less comes to fame through that. And this is one of those instances where she's not passive. I think a lot of other people in her position would have just been like so kind of embarrassed, that they would have been like, oh, you know, I'm going to retreat. I'm going to, you know, kind of go back and live a life of quiet retirement so no one knows what I do. And she's like, nope, this is an opportunity to just go harder. And so she sort of becomes more famous. She starts charging more. She has like even more elite lovers, and really becomes a sort of like this person you want to have over to your fancy parties because she's so notorious. Yeah, that's the kind of truth of her relationship with Falk, which is, yes, she was there when he had the stroke.
And let me just say, Sarah has been extremely PG-13 in explaining that particular episode. So please do find it in the book and read it in great detail, which is exactly how it was reported on in the press. So we have this life just ridden with scandal. We just talked about one of the major ones. I'd like to talk about the other major one that was sort of defined her life. What happened on the night of May 31st, 1908?
So we don't know. And that's the problem. What we do know is that morning, May 31st, 1908, her valet wakes up. He's sleeping in the attic of the house she shares with Adolf, her husband. And their mother had been staying with them for a few days. And he comes down to the second floor and he starts hearing noises. This is like 5:30 in the morning. And he sort of goes into the bedrooms where the family is. And he sees Meg tied to a bed with a gag by her side, crying out for help. And he also sees Adolf, her husband, dead of apparent strangulation. As well as her mother, also apparently strangled. And so he opens the windows and calls out for help, and the police come rushing. And so Meg she's the only survivor and also the only witness of this attack where her husband and mother were murdered. And the police, when they start questioning her, she says that she saw a red-headed woman and 3 men wearing long black robes and hats that looked like sombreros they broke into the house. They had intended to rob it. They thought no one would be there. They realized the inhabitants of the house are there, and so they kill her husband and mother. But they spare her life because they think that she is the adolescent daughter who's, you know, like maybe 17, 18, and Meg at this point is 39. So, you know, it is possible that there were men wearing like wide brimmed hats and long robes who broke in and you know, murder her husband and mother. That is a possibility. But there's a lot that sort of suggests that maybe that wasn't the story, in addition to the strange uniforms that they're wearing, the strange costumes that they're wearing. So there are no signs of a break-in. The door was unlocked. There's a lot of valuables which are left untouched in the house, and the sort of whole first floor of the house where there's a lot of valuable art and silver is completely untouched. And then even on the second floor where the murders happened, there are just like, jewelry and money in plain sight. There are crime scene photos, which you can see like in my book, but also in the internet, where it's pretty clear that the house is just not that disturbed. Like, the sort of closets are basically in order, and there are no signs of struggle on any of the bodies. And it also seems that there's the husband's murder has been staged. So there's a cord around his neck as if he was strangled with a rope, but in fact, he was strangled with his bare hands, with someone's bare hands. And then there's also a kind of like walking stick behind him as if he had tried to fight someone off. But there are, of course, no signs of struggle on his body, on the mother's body, or on Meg's body. It is a very perplexing story. It seems that Meg is lying. She was never very she and the truth were never close friends, shall we say. Everyone, the press knows that she's lying. The public knows that she's lying. People are really think she had something to do with it. Maybe she's covering the murders up, or maybe she actually did them. But the police say yeah, sure, we think she's telling the truth. We're going to find these robed men and the redheaded woman.
And so I just have to say, just from your narration of events, it sounds as though you're on team Meg did it. So just wanted to clarify that. And then also, if everyone else was so sure, why weren't the police? Especially because so many of these signs that you were talking about, they point to the fact that police were actually the ones who found out that, he wasn't, he was strangled. He wasn't sort of, hanged or whatever by rope. So what's going on there? And what do you think? Don't be.
Okay, so the chief investigator into the affair, he's a judge so by the kind of French judicial system, you sometimes have judges who are investigators into major criminal cases. He is probably her lover. And if not her lover, then at the very least an admirer. And so it is very clear that he specifically asked to be put on the case, and that he asked to be put on the case in order to shield her from scrutiny and protect her. And so one theory is that she did it. And the other theory is that she has a lover come over that night, and the lover is very rich and prominent and well-connected. The lover ends up quarreling with her husband, kills him. The mother dies sort of fright or accidentally. And then the lover and Meg stage this break-in. And that basically the police refuse to solve this, either because Meg herself is very well connected, very powerful, has tons of folks in the judiciary and the sort of politicians and French officialdom who are indebted to her lovers, who she knows their secrets, who she can call on, and or that her lover is. And so basically it's pretty clear that the police are not actually interested in solving the crime. And more generally, the police at the time essentially saw that part of their job was to protect elites' reputations, to kind of clean up their messes. And so this seems to be an example of it.
So then what happens to her? She gets away scot-free. She lives happily ever after.
Yeah. So the police are very willing to say she has nothing to do with it. We're going to catch these dastardly perpetrators. Of course they don't. But the problem she faces is that none of her high society friends will have her back. And none of them will like be her friends anymore or her lovers. And she's broke, and has no friends, and is like really facing a kind of social exclusion because everyone thinks she had something to do with the murders. And they say like, you have to clear your name and then we can like, you know, be your friend or be your lover again. So she's really desperate to clear her name. And so she turns eventually to the press to clear her name, and tells a reporter like, the police are about to arrest the perpetrators who matched my original description. And the police are like, no, we're not. Like, that's just not true. Stop lying. And then she gets desperate. So in November 1908, about sort of like 6 months after the murders, she plants evidence on her valet. So everyone now thinks her valet did it. And then in a very sort of sudden reversal, it's revealed that actually she planted the evidence. There's a sort of strange coincidence that means that it's discovered that he actually could not have done it. And then she's desperate again. And she's like, at this point, end of November 1908, the case is just monopolizing all the headlines. No one is paying attention to anything else. And so she says, oh, it was my cook's son. And I have known it all along. But I really like my cook and I wanted to protect her feelings. So I've been lying this whole time. And at this point, like the police have had it with her because she's just too sort of out of control. And her lover, essentially, this is a public furor. The Parisians are absolutely enraged that, you know, the police have gone so lightly on her and have protected her. And I keep arresting these like working class men, her valet, and then the cook's son, and are like, you know, clearly trying to protect her. And so her lover has no choice but to arrest her and throw her into jail, and charge her with, not with the murders initially, with complicity with murder for lying, basically. And then eventually at that point, she becomes the chief suspect. And, you know, everyone is convinced she did it. And all her secrets come pouring out. All the secrets of the French elite come pouring out. This is when a lot of folks find out about, you know, how exactly Felix Faure died, about all her lovers, about all the taxpayer money she got, that her lovers paid her for their affairs. And then she's put on trial 1 year later in November 1909 and is acquitted. And so, and she becomes a sort of like celebrity that everyone loves. And yeah, so that's basically the sort of very short version of what happens to her.
Thank you. Just messy. Maybe I know we want to get to the Q&A, so let me just pull the camera back and I just have two last questions.
Mm-hmm.
You're talking a bit about like how all of these secrets come spilling out, right? And it's not just Meg. I mean, she obviously takes it to an extreme, but it's this entire world that she's trying to access and eventually does access, this Parisian high society. Everybody is lying. Everyone is sweeping something under the rug. What sorts of problems does this cause? What can this tell us about sort of, you know, society? Even as I was hearing you mention the way that these politicians are using taxpayer dollars on their affairs and their this and their that, doesn't feel as long ago as I certainly wish that it did. So what are your thoughts around that?
It made for really difficult research and writing because everyone's lying. Like Meg lies her whole life. She sort of never tells the truth, even when it would be easier for her to tell the truth. But she often lies to make herself seem more important and also to protect her reputation. So anything she says is unreliable. And then all these people, like in high society, they are also lying. So, you know, they'll talk to the press, but they're always trying to defend their reputation first and foremost. And then if not that, then Meg's reputation. And then there's also the police file, which is also built on lies because they in many cases, the police are trying to make her look better. And in certain cases, they're trying to make her look worse. So it's really difficult to actually figure out what happened. And there's some cases as a result that I put in kind of multiple versions of the same event. It's I think of it as like a choose your own adventure, but nonfiction style. So I sort of say, like, here are the two versions, here's sort of what is more probable, what's not, to let the reader decide. But it's also, I really had to kind of sort through and say, like, well, is this backed up by other evidence? In some cases, I would have like 3 or 4 stories about the same event, and I would have to figure out what's the most probable one. And so it was an enormous headache. But I think ultimately I was always reminded that, like, there are 2 people who are murdered. And we have the sort of the crime scene photographs. We know that they're murdered. Something happened, right? And even as there's a sort of tangle of lies, it's sort of my job to figure out what is the most probable version of what happened, both in the murders and then like sort of more generally with her life.
That's really interesting. I always think, the one thing that everyone learns in high school history classes is sources have biases, but how much more those are compounded in the source space that you were looking at, which, is just sort of a reminder for me anyways, just what a remarkable historian you are, because you had to find different layers of evidence and you had to be really keen about the kinds of stories you were going to tell. And that comes out in the narrative as well. So just, you've done an amazing job.
Thank you.
If I can just ask you one last question, because after all, this is a book about scandal. There are always scandals in the news. We live in an age of scandal, in an age of tabloids when, some of our biggest celebrities become famous from sex tapes that are leaked, which I take to be sort of like the corollary, the 21st century corollary to some of the stuff going on with Meg. And I want to just quote you from your own book. On page 262, you're sort of talking a bit about scandals in general. And you write, scandals allow us to peer into the mess of other people's lives. Sometimes we're fascinated by them for purely voyeuristic reasons, but sometimes we're fascinated because they show us how power really operates. And so I was wondering if, as we're wrapping up here, you could just expand a little bit more on that, about why you love scandals, what draws you to them, and what parallels you see in our own modern age.
Yeah, I mean, I think that sort of like, I am always a person who like reads the kind of scandal article in Vanity Fair whenever it comes out, right? Just partly as like, it is like the sort of messiness of other people's lives. I think sometimes we're drawn to it because it is more exciting than our own lives, right? And it's, I was like writing a lot of the book during COVID, where it's like things are terrible. And then also I'm home all the time and nothing is happening. So let me just like peer into what's happening in the, late 19th and early 20th century. And I also think that there's this kind of this, like, we have so many scandals where like, oh, you just see how power works. And so I live in Central Virginia, about an hour away from Lynchburg, which is where the sort of Liberty University is based and where the Falwells are based. And there's been this very messy scandal having to do with Jerry Falwell Jr., I believe, his sort of marriage and sex life and relationship with Liberty. And there's financial allegations, but then also sexual ones. And I was really fascinated that this was kind of unfolding as I was writing the book, about like, here's someone who really, to maintain his power, put on this sort of front of like good behavior, as he was a kind of moral exemplar. But, behind the scenes, it was much more complicated and much sort of messier. But then once this all came revealed, you learned about sort of like, well, non-disclosure agreements, right? And how they're a sort of way for us to not know the truth, sometimes for good reason, but sometimes very much to protect people's reputations and prestige, right? Or sort of like, like the sort of, we've also learned about how people can influence the press also, or kind of access connections with the police to hide transgressions. And so I think scandals are these kind of moments of when like transgressions are revealed. And as a result, we sort of get to see, well, what does that actually take to maintain the sort of facade of good behavior? So that's something I was interested in, is like why this good behavior becomes so important in the late 19th and early 20th century. And then also kind of scandals in this moment where society gets to see how things actually operate. Yeah, great question.
I love your use of the word facade right there, because that's exactly what it comes down to. I also loved your example right now of Falwell, right? This pillar of virtue, these pillars of morality. And so I think what, another thing that scandal does that you're pointing out in this book is it exposes all that hypocrisy amongst those brand standards, right? And I think maybe that's also something that is satisfying. I don't know if that's the right word.
Yeah, I think it can be. So I drew a lot on this sort of work of a sociologist on scandals. And sometimes like scandals are interesting to us because we want like these sort of, it's a little bit of like Schadenfreude, right? Like we want these like rich people to be sort of, and powerful people to be brought low. But I think sometimes it's like we want to know that like everyone is just as messy as we are, right? That like, the sort of real life is actually much more complicated than the sort of image of perfection that people project. Yeah. Thank you so much. Those are great questions. And I know we have some time for questions from the audience.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah and Nimisha. What a pleasure to delve into this story and really think about it in larger terms. I can't help but think about the current scandal in the United States with the murder of Hae Min Lee and the release of Adnan Syed for her murder. That was a murder in 1999 that Sarah Koenig, in the podcast that made all podcasts possible, Serial, brought to our attention. And so when I think about Red Widow, I really think, Sarah, you're building on this really rich tradition, of course, of people trying to understand people others at the center of a scandal. And I was thinking about the police. What your book does is look at police procedure, the choices they make, where they may have gone wrong, why, who are they protecting and why? And in this case, you mentioned the elites. And then you have the accused and the classic unreliable narrator, which for a historian poses a particular challenge. And so that's the first question is, as a historian, and we got a lovely comment calling you an investigative historian. And
I love that.
It's a real challenge for those of us trained to facts only, no speculation, no putting yourself inside the head of. What was that like for you as a historian to deal with someone and many entities who were unreliable narrators?
Yeah, so it was both frustrating and fascinating. And I would say frustrating because, of course, I want to know what actually happened. And in some cases, I can't know. And in other cases, it took me like, basically I felt like it was a jigsaw puzzle where I get one fact from this, newspaper like article, and then another fact from another newspaper article, and, all sort of, and just try and put them together to create a picture. So it was really frustrating. I did with Meg in particular, I got used to the patterns of her lying. Which is that, so she writes her memoirs. They're really unreliable. They're just all lies. Even at the time, people knew they were lies. They're also super anti-Semitic. So they're not great. But I got used to that she always wants to put herself at the sort of center of drama, always wants to make herself like someone who's like, you know, the kind of center of any exciting story. So for instance, when like it's found out that she had planted evidence on her valet, what she tells the press is like, oh, someone is plotting against me, and I don't understand how any of this is happening. It's just that someone is plotting against me, which is like a very bold claim, right? To say like my enemies, they hate me. So I had to get used to sort of her like putting herself at the center of every drama and being like, that's probably not true. And then it's a lot of reading of silences. So it's a lot of like, what are people not saying? What are the police not investigating? You know, when is there like a sort of someone is giving an interview with the press and they're very descriptive, but then they cut out? Or even the judge at her trial, when would he say like, oh, we can skim over this for modesty's sake? And sort of like, okay, let's think about what's probably there as a result. So it's something that historians often have to do, is we have these incomplete records. And so we're often reading silences, you know, trying to figure out what are people not saying, and what does that mean? So yeah, it was a complicated process. And you know, the sort of claims I make in the book, they are things where I have two independent sources, or one source where I know is really reliable. You know, so I was sort of trying to say like, okay, if these both say it, then it's probably true. But there was a lot of sort of doubt at times. Like, I think she was blackmailing Felix Fauve's widow. But I'm not 100% sure, because it only comes from one source, but it sounds like something she would do. And so there's often a fair amount of kind of uncertainty, even as like the kind of patterns of her life, that she's someone who's always pushing what she can get away with, and is sort of exploiting any situation to her benefit. That's something I was sort of very like kind of aware of what the patterns are. Yeah, that's a great question.
And then there's the question of women and
Yeah.
gender embedded in several spheres. Of course, the criminal justice system, marriage, illicit sex, empowerment, reproductive freedom, and then political expressions of political power, and writing and publishing, and telling one's story. There's just so many. If this were a Venn diagram, if your book just overlaps in so many areas, and that's still true today, when we're looking at the writing of history and trying to tease out from the historical record, what were the lived experiences of women, and where are their voices? Sometimes those voices are ones like this one. We're like, oh, cringe. What's true? What's not true? It's a much more unvarnished, and I think much more compelling in that way. And then so the question really is, where do you position the Red Widow in a larger history of women? What's the historiography there for those of us who are lovers of history? Where is it?
So it's a great question. And I think there are a couple of different answers to this. So one is, I think in terms of like our own media ecosphere, I think we kind of love stories about really bad women right now. Like I'm thinking like Anna Delvey, right? Of sort of inventing Anna. Like we love the kind of the women who scam genre, which I enjoy greatly. Is like, that's a sort of fairly popular genre right now. And I think she herself was not a scammer. She was scammer adjacent. But she was not a scammer. And I think that we sort of love these stories Partly because there's something fun about watching someone just take a sledgehammer to the rules and do whatever they want. And again, I was writing this in COVID where everything was terrible, and also we're all trying to figure out this new set of rules about masking, about social distancing, about risk, about which masks are better, and they're constantly shifting as we came to know more. And so, there's something about like this sort of feeling so kind of like there's this new set of rules I have to master. And it was so much fun to just write about someone who was just not obeying anything. So I think there's the kind of like our own media, I guess, like we love these sort of women who are a little bit badly behaved. I think that it's also, this is something Nimisha has written about, is the way that women can access power and influence through really aligning themselves with kind of quite like patriarchal and sexist norms. And so that, she has a lot of political power through her relationship with Felix Faure. And then afterwards, she also has a lot of influence over the French civil service. And she gets a lot of benefits from, her connections, including like money, as well as, I'm trying to shield her from scrutiny. But she does that through, I think, really appealing to sort of like, men's desires. I think in many ways, she's living in the era of first wave feminism, but she herself is not a feminist at all. And she really is always trying to find a kind of older male protector who will sort of like take care of her. Even though there are ways in which she's also this sort of independent, ambitious woman. But it's a sort of interesting position of the kind of way in which women, particularly, right, kind of like elite white women who can appeal to sort of men in these sexual ways, when they can sort of sometimes benefit from these quite sort of sexist structures, even as they're constrained in other ways, right? She couldn't vote. She couldn't hold office. She had no control over her property. And so, I was really sort of struck by how she makes her way in the society through kind of appealing to certain forms of tradition.
And Nimisha, maybe you'd like to weigh in here as well, because sometimes there's been a tendency, particularly during in the United States, the second wave era of feminist historiography, U.S. history, of women, that usually they were looking for and reifying all women feminists, and that was just not the case. There are women who deeply align themselves with the patriarchal structures for whatever kinds of empowerment they can garner. What say ye on this larger issue of your book, but the issues that Sarah raises about where you look at actual women in history who live their lives defying maybe what sometimes historians want them to be?
Yeah, super interesting. Sarah, I'm so glad that you brought this up. And Patricia, thanks for asking the question. I think, the first round was sort of recuperative. The first round of these historical narratives were recuperative. And maybe that's sort of normal, right? We want to say these people existed too, right? And they mattered. And then maybe because of the timing, the sort of second wave, not just of feminism, but also of the historiography was, and if they existed, they were feminists, right? If they existed, then they made their will be done. And then things started to complicate from there. Then we start talking a little bit about agency. Well, where is the source of agency? And as Sarah, you were just saying, is it from sort of these traditional notions, these more conservative even notions of femininity, heterosexuality, and that sort of thing? And I think most recently, one of the things I'm finding really interesting is also just thinking the extent to which ours is a very liberal idea of what agency is, as though agency or women's empowerment can only come at the expense of patriarchal society, right? There's a lot of really interesting literature that's saying, well, that's kind of a liberal Western feminist way of looking looking at it. And there could be these other ways. But Sarah, I know you've thought a lot more about this than I have. So
yeah, I think I mean, I think it's this, what's interesting to me is this question goes back to Meg's own day, because there were feminists who were observing her trial, and they really want to see, they like tried to claim her as a hero because she's so, at the trial, she's so smart, she's so eloquent, you know, she's really sort of like totally impressive. She just sort of bulldozes anyone who's trying to question her and is like, you're wrong and I hate you. And and so they really wanted to see this as like a triumph, right? Because we, you know, like we want to see that. We want to see that sort of like, you know, women can overcome. But she wasn't, right? And so it's this, they're trying to fit her into this feminist paradigm of like, look at this tremendously smart woman. And she is very smart, but she's really using all her intelligence to like put, you know, innocent poor people into trouble, to blame Jews, which is not something we had a lot of time to talk about, but is a consistent pattern in her life for doing things that, you know, like they did not do, and is also really, you know, like sort of just wants what she can get out of a patriarchal system. And she's never trying to change the rules of the game. So I was really struck by how this desire for these feminist heroines goes back so far, but just doesn't really map on to the reality of so many women's lives.
I know we're at the top of the hour, but if we have a few more minutes left, I would love it if the two of you, if you can stay just a few more minutes. A crime, Nimisha, is that okay with you? Just a few more minutes. A crime, a discussion of crime wouldn't be complete without a discussion of consumption. There's my cat tail. I don't know if anybody just saw that. Everybody in the virtual world just saw my cat Toasty knock a cat tail right in front of me. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. But I guess that's the sign that I was supposed to be done. But anyway, Toasty, I have other things to do. If we're thinking about the public consumption of scandal, and confession, or confessing for a friend, I read the Daily Mail. Okay, that's my source. Okay. How the question comes from Wynne Guston, how has public consumption of scandal changed or not changed since Meg's time? And that includes, of course, the Dreyfus affair. You're talking about anti-Semitism and what rocked the Belle Epoque, among other scandals, was the Dreyfus affair. So what do you think, Sarah? And Nimisha, if you want to weigh in on that too. Public consumption of scandal.
So this is great. So Wynne Guston is a former student of mine. So hi there. And hope you're doing well. And it's so interesting to me. Like, I do think that there's so much similarity, right, in the sort of public consumption, that this is something we want. We still have kind of echoes of these really awful anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, QAnon being one of them. And so I think that, you know, like, as much as we would like to think that certain things change, there's seems to be a lot of stability in that we, you know, for centuries we've like these sort of these like stories of rich people behaving badly. But I do think there are some differences. So I think that there's kind of like, there are more voices in the conversation now. And I think that's partly through sort of, right, like social media, but I also think that there's just like kind of more outlets for people who were outside the system. And so that there can be this sort of like more dialogue that really kind of pushes back against some of these narratives. But it's interesting. I mean, I think we're sort of constantly revising our understanding of scandals that even happened, say, 20 years ago. One example being, like, we have a much different understanding of, you know, Bill Clinton's affairs now than we did in the 1990s. And I don't know, like, part of me wants to say like we're doing better, right? And we sort of understand the dynamics, but I also think that there's so much continuity with the sort of what we can see in the late 19th and early 20th century in terms of who gets targeted, in terms of the kind of misogyny and homophobia that can emerge out of scandals, as well as like racism and anti-Semitism, all of which emerged in this one. And so, yeah, I don't know, like there's the part of me that's like, things are better, we're more aware. And then there's a part of me that's like, no, that's not true at all.
Nimisha, do you want to weigh in? No. Okay.
Nothing to add there. I'm so glad you brought up the Lewinsky-Clinton affair, though, because that was exactly what I was thinking about.
Yeah.
I was thinking of sex tapes. And I know that Nimisha had said that, Sarah, you gave us the PG-13 version, and that's not what's in the book. So if anybody really wants to know, I'm just thinking about Kim Kardashian, who just did her Dolce & Gabbana Milan Fashion Week debut. And, sex tapes did not hurt her reputation. She recovered it and refashioned it. And the women in industries are so fascinating, and women in institutions are so fascinating. And that's why I love this book, Sarah, because what you've got is a woman at an incredibly important time period in not just French history, but in Western history and in women's history, that I hope people are going to just go out and gobble up, because there's something emblematic about the story of, the title of your book, The Red Widow. And I so appreciate the fact that you wrote this book to open a window into that time period and try to recover that history. And you started this conversation off with a tour of Père Lachaise. Everybody needs to go there because it's iconic and amazing and humbling, and you just can't believe it. So I hope that if there are several takeaways from this book. First of all, read The Red Widow, and second, really explore this subject more fully, because we've been looking at and reproductive citizens, gender, immigration in the state in modern France, 1880 to 1994. That's Nimisha Barton's book. You've got these two books here that are tackling these stories, and I want to encourage people to look at what historians are doing today and how they are recovering these histories and looking at sources differently. And I want to thank the two of you for being in such a rich and deep conversation. And how many puns could we take out of this conversation? I'm going to leave it up to the YouTube audience to get on in there and see what they can glean from that. I want to thank Sarah Horowitz and Nimisha Barton for being in conversation. Sarah's book is The Red Widow, The Scandal That Shook Paris, and the woman behind it all. Thank you so much, audience, for joining us this evening, and we wish you a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. This was so much fun.